earlier this afternoon, some news broke that the Bengals have decided to franchise tag T. Higgins. And the reason I'm bringing it up here on this Packers channel is because throughout lots of the offseason, a lot of Packers fans have been wanting the Packers to target one of these potential free agent wide receivers, and T. Higgins was one of those. And I made a few videos about T. Higgins and the possibility of him coming to Green Bay. And my take is, I think that when you add a receiver of that caliber, no doubt it would make the Packers better. I just didn't know if it was the best use of money. I would rather the Packers spend 25 to 30 million on an edge rusher. But at the same time, I wouldn't be opposed to someone like T. Higgins coming to Green Bay. And so now that he has been franchise tagged by the Bengals, on the first thought, you think, okay, well, the Bengals are probably going to have him in the 2025 season. But that's not necessarily what's going to happen here, in my opinion. There's a lot of possibilities. The Bengals have said that they want to sign T. Higgins to a long-term deal. I think that the reality of that actually coming to fruition isn't, 100% going to happen necessarily, because the Bengals and T. Higgins have to come to an agreement on a deal. And when we look at the Packers and their past with franchising a top-tier receiver in Davante Adams, pretty quickly after franchising Davante Adams, the Packers traded him for a first and second round pick. And so when you look at the situation, I still think there's a chance that T. Higgins ends up on another roster through a tag and trade if the Bengals and T. Higgins cannot come to an agreement on what they believe T. Higgins' value really is. And T. Higgins is frustrated enough that he doesn't want to play for the Bengals. They could decide to trade him for draft capital. And so that's a scenario where if the Packers really wanted T. Higgins, they could be, contemplating right now how much they think T. Higgins would be worth in a trade situation. Because in my mind, if you're the Bengals, I don't think it's smart to pay T. Higgins $30-ish million a year when they're also going to have to pay Jamar Chase somewhere between $35 to $40 million a year. I think spending that much on two receivers is just a little excessive in my mind. And when you have a quarterback of Joe Burrow's caliber, I think that you can move on from T. Higgins, maybe draft a receiver somewhere early in the draft and try to replace Higgins. And while that receiver may not get to 100% of what T. Higgins would be, maybe you can still get a guy who's, 80% of the player T. Higgins is for, 1/25 of the cost, or, maybe more depending on when they draft that receiver. So if I was the Bengals, I think the smart move is to tag T. Higgins and trade him away for draft capital. And so I think that's what could happen here if the Bengals and T. Higgins can't come to an agreement. And I want to share this from Mike Florio on February 25th. He shared this on his site, Pro Football Talk. He said on Tuesday afternoon, the Bengals power structure had some things to say about receiver T. Higgins. On Tuesday night, Higgins posted a one emoji response. Higgins posted the cap symbol on Twitter. It's a universal indication that the person using it believes a lie has been told. The alleged falsehood apparently comes from Bengals Director of Player Personnel, Duke Tobin's claim that the team intends to sign Higgins to a long-term deal. So if you're the Bengals and let's say in the back of your mind that you and T. Higgins aren't going to come to an agreement on a long-term deal, would you really just let him go into free agency when you have the ability to put a tag on him and get draft capital in return? I just think that from a team perspective, it makes much more sense to tag a player than just let them go out to free agency if you could get some kind of draft capital in return. Now, I think some teams would be kind to the player and say, if they really weren't going to agree to some kind of deal, they just let him hit free agency because then that player gets to go out, get as much money as possible. But if you're a team thinking about how can we get as much draft capital as possible, why would you let a guy go out to free agency when you can tag him and trade him and get something in return instead of just letting him go out for nothing? So I'm still not convinced one way or the other that the Bengals really want him in 2025. I think this could just be a tag and trade scenario. And so if you're the Packers, is it really worth trading for T. Higgins now? Because I think if you look at the free agent market, even without having to trade away draft capital for Higgins, you have to debate, if you're the Packers, do you want to pay him whatever he thinks he's worth? Because you're going to be, if he had gone to free agency, you would have been bidding against other wide receiver needy teams. And so I just think going to free agency route, the Packers probably wouldn't have signed him. I just don't see them outbidding every other wide receiver needy team. When Gutekunst has talked about the fact that, he thinks that when, when you look at some teams, he said this earlier this offseason. I think historically, if you look at a lot of the teams, very rarely do teams that have one receiver that's super heavy with targets, that doesn't usually play out well for playoffs and success there. So I'm not convinced Gutekunst wants to spend up at wide receiver. And now the fact that you have to also trade for T. Higgins, I'm not sure if the Packers would do it. And looking at some of the recent receiver moves, like the Niners trading Deebo Samuel for a 5th-round pick, it does make you wonder, what would you have to trade for T. Higgins? I don't think it's good to really... I don't think that Deebo Samuel situation is anywhere near what's going to happen with T. Higgins. T. Higgins is 26. Deebo's 29. I also saw that with the Deebo trade, from some reports I saw, the Commanders aren't planning on giving him an extension before the season, meaning he's just going to be under a 1-year deal. And so a 5th-round pick, I think, makes more sense for that. A guy who's 29, a guy who's declined from previous production in recent years. You look at T. Higgins, 3 years younger. There is some injury risk. He's missed 5 games the past 2 seasons, each of the past 2 seasons. So in my mind, I think T. Higgins could be worth a 2nd or 3rd-round pick just because he is younger. He's still a really solid receiver. I don't think he's going to go for a 4th or 5th. I think if you do trade for T. Higgins in this scenario, you have to trust that or know before you trade for him that he wants to play for your team and that he wants to sign an extension, because I don't think you trade away, a 2nd-round pick for a guy that's going to be on a tag for 1 season. That's a bad idea. And so if you can assure that he's going to sign an extension with you and be with you for 3-4 years, then I think sending over a 2nd-round pick isn't a bad decision, because you're getting a really talented player. You have to pay him, but you're going to get some really solid production. There is question there with some of the injury history. So in my opinion, I don't think the Packers need to trade for T. Higgins. Would it help the team? Yes, it would. No doubt the Packers would be better. I still have some questions with his injury history. That's slightly concerning. But as I touched on the DK Metcalf situation a few days ago, if you guys want to see that video, it's on my channel recently, breaking down the conflicting reports. A couple guys were saying that the Packers and Seahawks were discussing a potential trade. One source ended up saying that that wasn't the case. So we don't know what's true out there. But if that were to be true, and the Packers were debating trading for DK Metcalf, I think that trading for T. Higgins could be a similar type conversation. So do I think in the end the Packers trade for T. Higgins? Likely not. At the same time, I think that with where the Packers are right now, I think that a veteran receiver can be useful, more so than maybe in years past, where previous years before Devontae left, you had a top-tier elite guy. And now I think you have guys who can be that. We just haven't seen it consistently when it comes to the level of production from these receivers. So we'll keep an eye on T. Higgins. I don't think just because he's tagged, it means he's necessarily going to stay with the Bengals. Things can change quickly, as we saw with Devontae getting traded when he got tagged. So we'll keep an eye on it, and we'll sort of see what happens going forward. If you want more Packers content, feel free to subscribe. I put out Packers news on this channel. Stay tuned for free agent updates, signings, trades, if a trade is to happen. So make sure you have the post notifications on so you do not miss any Packers content. But thank you guys for watching, as always, and I'll see you guys next time.